Welcome to the Get Real Therapy podcast, where we educate and empower you with real therapeutic tools to help you improve your life. If you're listening to this podcast, consider this a sign that you're exactly where you're supposed to be. It's time to get real. Well, welcome everybody to the Get Real Therapy podcast, episode 3. I'm Abby.
And I'm V.
And we're super excited that you're here.
So in today's episode, we're going to go ahead and see how IFS therapy relates, or how we could view IFS therapy through the scope of a relationship. You know, like in terms of how you could even change your language and with any kind of relationship, whether it's a significant other or whether it's with family members or just anybody you want to have a relationship with. And one of the most important things that we can do to learn how you start to bond with people is through a study that they did 50 years ago that helped you essentially determine which parts get activated or which parts you start to go ahead and develop. And they essentially categorized them. And these categories ended up being called attachment theory.
Attachment theory was born out of the work of some psychologists who were trying to go ahead and understand the bonds between caregiver and child and how that affects the development of the children, their social development, their emotional development. So attachment theory was developed about, I think, like 50 years ago. There's 4 attachment styles that can go ahead and be produced from the dynamic interactions between the child and the caregiver. So they were able to determine that we as humans develop one of 4 attachment styles that really gets formed within the first 12 months of life and really is then kind of stuck with us thereafter.
Now, there's 4, but in reality, there's just secure and then insecure, right?
Yes. So there's a secure attachment, and then there's 3 other styles of attachment that would fall underneath the insecure category.
Okay.
So of course, we all want to be secure. And so we'll dive into each one, and there's so many different questionnaires that you can go ahead and fill out online that will tell you your attachment style, which is great if you don't already know it. They have ones ranging from just a couple questions to being more like 10, 15 minutes long. You might even just be able to kind of get an idea of what your attachment style is by the end of this episode when I go ahead and describe them. And we can also talk about our own personal ones and our experiences of them and how they show up in our relationships in our life. And so when you develop these attachment styles in childhood, they go on to impact you as an adult in all of your relationships. Where your attachment style shows up the most, though, as an adult is going to be with your significant other, because your significant other becomes the closest attachment figure compared to what your parents were when you were a child. Your adult relationships with your significant other becomes that primary attachment figure.
Or lack thereof. Like, I've seen some people say, I don't want to have a significant other.
Oh, yes, exactly. Yeah, we'll go into like what attachment that kind of falls into. Exactly. So as I mentioned, the attachment style really gets developed within the first 12 months of life. The interactions between the parent and the child is going to go ahead and influence the development of the attachment style for the child. So it's not to say that you can't go ahead and change your attachment style once you're an adult, but the earlier you are when you get to work on it, the easier it's going to be. And that is for a couple different reasons. One, neurons in your brain that fire together, wire together. So that essentially means that whatever you practice the most, whatever behaviors, whatever thoughts, whatever belief, whatever movements you practice the most are going to have the most chance of firing in your brain and be the most automatic. So if you consistently had highly critical parents as a child, you probably internalize that into your own inner critics. And so therefore, if that was just reinforced, over and over and over again throughout your childhood, through your adolescence, and now you're an adult, you probably are hard on yourself, judge yourself, be super intolerant of making mistakes or getting really stressed out when you make mistakes. Again, the earlier of an intervention that you could do with really repairing some of those attachment wounds, the better off you're going to go ahead and be. But it's never too late to become what they call earned secure through working on yourself. So Secure attachment, that's obviously what we all want. When you have a secure attachment, it leads to greater self-esteem, greater self-confidence. You're able to have emotionally intimate relationships with people. You're able to hold healthy boundaries within those relationships. You have trust in yourself, and you also have trust of others in the world. These are all stemming from the early interactions that we have with our primary caregivers, and then whatever was the most repeated experiences through our childhood. Now you have the 3 insecure styles of attachment. And I also want to note that I also like to call them strategies for connection instead of just styles. So really the attachment style, you could say, is an attachment strategy. And so you'll see kind of why I state that now as I continue through this.
Because of the fact that you're changing the word, attachment style to an attachment strategy, I think that is on the basis of IFS therapy itself, right? Because of the fact that I know you're going to go ahead and talk about it later, but this isn't a unique, I guess, change in the vernacular of expressing what these styles are. It could be also in a lot of other forms of, I guess, pathologies, or specifically psychological pathologies like OCD, ADD. That's the exact same thing. It's usually parts. So it's more of even OCD, ADD, those are just strategies as well.
Oh, for sure. There's strategies for making yourself feel safe in one way, shape, or form. And so you can really see through attachment theory that a lot of pathology stems from those insecure attachment styles, insecure attachment strategies. And so
Exactly. So it's essentially the first small snowball that eventually gets bigger and bigger and bigger as you progress through life.
Yes.
You essentially started with this small snowball that was either secure and it leads to great things, or you get these 3 different variants of insecure attachments, and then they're going to go ahead and have their own ramifications.
they're going to manifest
but again,
in their own way.
What you're saying is that they are strategies that you learned from infancy to deal with the environment that you were brought into.
And to try to go ahead and connect with your caregivers.
Yes.
Because as a child, if you don't have connection with your caregivers, you're out of luck because you're a baby, you're a toddler, you're a small kid. Number one, you don't have the movement, you don't have the language, you don't have anything. You are solely dependent on those caregivers for your survival. So if there was inconsistency inside of those relationships, if there was any type of fear inside of those relationships, it's going to go ahead and affect the development of that child.
And learning about these things blew my mind, because I know you're going to go ahead and talk about it, but let's talk about that example that you gave me,
the study?
Yeah.
Yeah. So in the past, when they were working on developing this theory, they ran a bunch of studies with children and their mothers. And so the children that they used in the study were about 1.5 years old. And it takes place where a mom and her baby are inside of a random room. And in the room, there's a chair, there's toys on the floor for the baby to play with. So the mom is in the room with the baby's on the floor playing with the toys. The mom gets up and she leaves the room. The child is left there. So in example number 1, for everyone to play along with this, you're going to go ahead and determine which baby is the secure baby in this example or the insecure baby. So this is number 1, the first child. So the mom leaves the room, the baby's left there with the toys on the floor. The baby starts crying. A stranger comes into the room, tries to console the baby. Baby still can't be consoled. Cry. The mom comes back to the room. Immediately, the baby stops crying. The baby crawls over to her and just starts to calm down. The mom is holding the child at this point, really just showing the child like, hey, I'm back. I missed you. Nice to see you. The child feels calm, eventually starts to go back to play with these toys. So that's example number 1. Example number 2, mom leaves the room. The baby's on the floor with the toys. Baby doesn't cry. Baby just keeps playing with the toys. A stranger comes into the room. The baby doesn't really care too much, just keeps playing with the toys. Mom comes back into the room. Baby still keeps playing with the toys. So the question is, which baby would be considered the secure baby? The one that cried when the mom left but calmed down when she came back, or the one who didn't cry at all the entire time? So think for a second which one you think it is, and then now I'll tell you. So the baby that was actually the secure baby was the one that did cry when the mom left and calmed down when she returned. The baby who didn't cry at all There's a reason the baby didn't cry at all, because there's been a history of caregiving where if I cry, my caregivers don't come. So essentially, the baby has learned that their voice doesn't matter. So there's no reason to go ahead and cry. And in an effort to help regulate themselves, they look to the environment to calm themselves down. So they look to the toys, they look to objects to try to go ahead and soothe themselves. But this is obviously not a healthy thing to go ahead and do, because as a child, you're not going to get your comfort and your security from a toy. That's just not, the toy's not going to feed you. The toy's not going to change your diaper. The toy's not going to keep you safe. So the fact that the child has learned my voice doesn't matter and I'm just going to go ahead and kind of zone out and play with these toys, that's not helping that child develop mentally and socially and emotionally. They're basically learning I don't matter and other people are not reliable and I can't trust. And so what they did in that study is that they actually measured the cortisol levels of the babies. And then cortisol is a stress hormone. So obviously when you're really stressed out, you're going to have higher cortisol levels than when you're more relaxed. And so in that study, the baby who didn't cry at all had much higher cortisol levels than the baby who did cry when the mom left. And so
even though the baby looked fine, exteriorly,
yes,
it was essentially freaking out the entire time.
Yes, exactly. And that's the thing in American society, Western society, we value such independence. And we think that from a young age, oh, my child's so relaxed, so calm, they don't cry, they can be left alone, they just play so well by themselves. I'm not going to say that in every scenario that is a baby who's developed what's considered an insecure avoidant attachment style, but it's something to pay attention to, because the baby's only ability is their cry. That's their voice. They can't talk. They can't do anything else. That is their only method of communication. And so the parent's job is to figure out, oh, my kid's crying. Does the diaper need to be changed? Is this child hungry? Are they cold? Do they not feel good? Do they just need some connection? Whatever the case may be, you have to keep responding consistently to that child.
And this reminds me of, I guess, some methodologies that parents do to go ahead and essentially train their baby. What is it when?
Like sleep training. Is that what you're referring to?
Yeah, sleep training. And before understanding this, I thought sleep training was great. And now that I understand that, yeah, you're right. The baby's only form of communication is by crying. It can't do anything else. And you see this time and time again. How you're able to communicate is going to be your limitations in how you're able to communicate, from being an infant to being a child, to being a teenager, to being at different forms of communications at different stages in your life, is going to vary. So you need to be aware of that as a parent, because a baby crying is very different from, a teenager crying or an adult crying. Those are very different things. So you see this time and time again, that the sources of the problem is your limited ability to communicate, and then using the tools that you have at your disposal to communicate. So because you understand now, or I'm hoping because people are starting to understand now, that the limitations of communication have to be taken more seriously. So because of the baby's only option is to go ahead and cry, those need to be considered as a more serious form of communication. And eventually it starts to go ahead and do other things. Like, for example, I've seen many patients not eat, and that's a form of communication, or throwing a temper tantrum, and that's a form of communication. Well, I guess that's sort of the same thing as crying, but regardless, as you go ahead and continue and start using more cognitive functions and higher level forms of thinking, then you could go ahead and start to listen to the words instead of the actions.
Yeah, there's always a need behind the behavior. No matter how old any person is,
Yes.
there's always some type of need behind each behavior. There's a purpose to that behavior, whether the individual understands that on a conscious level and they're just reacting and acting out. It's our job ultimately to be aware that what other people are doing is just a reflection of some unmet need.
Oh, absolutely. And I mean that more in terms of, when I said that, I'm talking about for the parents.
So then you have the insecure, anxious, preoccupied attachment style, where you have a lot of anxiety. You seek your worth through relationships. So where it's the dismissive avoidant, where you don't feel comfortable and safe in relationships, for the anxious, preoccupied, you feel safer in relationships, even though you still have a high degree of low trust. Well, even though you still don't have a lot of trust in those relationships, you have a deep fear of abandonment. And so this comes from inconsistent caregiving, where I cried and sometimes my caregivers came and sometimes they didn't. So I learned that if I cry a lot, that there's maybe a greater chance for them to come and comfort me. So now in the studies that we were talking about before, you have this baby who cries when the mom leaves, but then when the mom comes back, still keeps crying. And it's like a lot more difficult to console. Eventually the child does calm down, but essentially it's like, if I cry, I'll keep my caregivers in sight. My caregivers will stay close to me if I'm crying. So that's their strategy, is that I'm going to try to really like make myself known so that people will stay close to me. But of course, this like backfires as an adult. This is the typical clingy person in a relationship. This is the person who can't stay single because they really seek their self-worth through relationships. That's where they feel safe, even though they don't really feel safe because they don't really trust on a deep level. Because again, even though they had some history of consistent caregiving, they also had a history of inconsistent caregiving.
Yeah. And in that example with the baby, I wanted to go ahead and clarify that you're basically stating, obviously, when they did this study, they're just showing one example of the mom leaving and then coming back. But you're basically stating that this is all through the history of learning these techniques for the baby itself. So in this anxious attachment strategy, right, you're basically stating that the baby in its home environment was essentially having its needs met sometimes, and then sometimes it wasn't. So it was essentially inconsistent. Okay, so now
Exactly.
as the baby, like you said before, I'm able to go ahead and realize that as long as I go ahead and keep crying, I use that as a tool for communication. But this time, I'm going to overuse that tool.
And the baby is dysregulated. That's why, and they're dysregulated because of that inconsistency in
Yes.
the caregiving. Because think about like as an adult, like if you get hungry, right, you quickly start to get in a bad mood, right? You start to get more angry, more irritated, more annoyed. You physically like don't feel good. You feel depleted. You're losing energy. You're losing focus. So if you think about that for a child, right, for a baby, when a baby's body is like cry to get a need met, the baby doesn't know what's wrong with it. It doesn't know that it's hungry. It doesn't know that it's thirsty. It just, biology says, evolution says, these are the alarm systems that are going to go off when we need some type of need met. And so it's not like the baby's consciously thinking, oh, if they just give me a snack, I'll be fine, you know? And so I say that to go ahead and explain that that's why we have to be so attuned with children, because they learn from us how to be attuned to themselves. So for example, let's just say really busy parents, right? And a lot of parents are busy, but you're teaching your child what is going to be self-care for them when they grow up. So if you didn't have a parent that you saw drinking water a lot and like refilling up water bottles, giving you water, making sure that you have water throughout the day, you're going to become the adult who doesn't drink a lot of water because you just never really learned to go ahead and do it because your
Monkey
parents
see,
didn't
monkey
do it.
do.
Yeah. And so that's just like an example of something that's like simple. And so it goes just so much further with all of the experiences as a child, because again, we know nothing. Then we have the final attachment style. And this one, I'm going to note, you can't actually call it a strategy. It's considered disorganized attachment. And the reason I say that you can't really consider this a strategy is because of the fact that the child has a disorganized attachment means that they did not know how to get their needs met. They did not come up with a clear strategy. They didn't come up with I'm just going to go ahead and be avoidant and just, not depend on anybody. And, I'm not going to like go ahead and try to get attention by crying and really using my voice. They don't know what to do because for them, they have had a history of caregiving where there was terror, there was fear coming from one of their caregivers. So this is a situation where there's emotional abuse, there's physical abuse, there's domestic violence in the home. The child is afraid of one or both of their caregivers. And so in our brain, we have circuits, neural networks that are geared towards wanting to connect, right? Wanting to go towards safety when we're afraid. So for a child, you would think, oh, their parents make them feel safe. But for a child with disorganized attachment, they want to go to their parent for comfort when they're afraid, but also their parent is the source of fear. So it's literally like this back and forth in their brain where it's like, I want to reach for my parent to comfort me, but also my parent is terrifying me and I can't trust them and I'm afraid. So you can see how disorganizing that is to a child. Like they have no strategy now. I can't go to my parents because, or one of my parents, I can't trust them. And I'm also super afraid and I have nobody to lean on. And so that creates disorganized attachment. And disorganized attachment as an adult leads into really insecure, unstable relationship patterns. They really have a low sense of self-worth. They don't trust other people. They have maladaptive coping skills. So people with the disorganized attachment, these are the people who have the highest risk for more severe mental health issues, specifically starting in childhood and adolescence through adulthood. These are like the more higher risk population.
Then when we were discussing this before, you told me something that was very interesting in terms of how even the baby would walk.
Walk?
Yeah. You told me that the baby in a situation where it's wants to go to the caregiver, but at the same time is afraid, would go backwards.
Oh, yes. Yeah. This is also can be seen when you see another example of this is like picking up a crying, screaming child who also turns their head away from the caregiver. So it's like their caregiver's picking them up, but they're also so afraid that it's like, I don't want to actually be that close to you. And so
that's so sad.
Yeah. And so they don't have a clear strategy for connection and relationships. So those are the four primary attachment styles. Again, secure, dismissive avoidant, anxious preoccupied, and then disorganized.
So really quickly, we talked about how the baby behaves, but let's talk about how the parents' behavior was to lead to these attachment styles.
Yes.
So obviously for the secure attachment style, what would the behavior be?
So somebody who develops a secure attachment style, again, they have a history of consistent caregiving with their parents. They can trust them. The parent provides for their emotional, physical, spiritual, cognitive needs. It supports their development. So there's four primary also parenting styles that really contribute to the development of attachment styles. So to describe these with the four primary parenting styles, you have something that's called authoritative. So authoritative is the secure version of the parenting style. Authoritative means that the parents are high on nurture, high on love, high on warmth in the home, and they're also high on structure. So they have good, healthy boundaries in their home, good, healthy discipline methods in their home. The child can go to them when they're afraid. The child can go to them and the parent will go ahead and be there for them emotionally, be there for them physically, and really just support their overall growth. Then you have what's known as the permissive parenting style. Permissive is high on nurture, so high on love, high on warmth, and low on structure. So these are the children who their parents really love them, maybe kisses, hugs, but they're kind of left to do whatever they want. So there's really no really strong discipline, really no strong schedule in the house, no strong boundaries. It's just kind of a free-for-all. And so this leads to the child, not really knowing what is their role kind of in the world, because they're just kind of didn't have any type of like structure or game plan to like show them what they're supposed to go ahead and do. Then you have the authoritarian parenting style. Authoritarian is low on nurture, so not a lot of love, not a lot of connection, and it's high on structure. So a lot of discipline, a lot of like scheduling, this is the way that it's supposed to be. And obviously this really leads children to have really low self-esteem and to develop really strong like inner critics, because guess what? It was very punitive in my house. It was very structured. Like you couldn't mess up. You couldn't make mistakes. You had to be following the rules all the time. And my parents really didn't show me love. So that's considered the authoritarian parenting style.
And that one leads to which, I guess it could lead to any one of them?
It can lead to dismissive. It could lead to the anxious as well, because again, it's.
But for sure, it's going to lead to it could
lead to disorganized, depending on what was their punitive discipline method? Were they spanking their children?
Exactly.
You know?
So essentially, again, with everything else, there's spectrums.
Yes, it definitely is on a spectrum for sure. And you're gonna, range from like mild, moderate to severe.
Okay. And number 4?
And then finally, there's neglectful parenting. So this is low on nurture, low on structure. So this is where there's a lot of abuse in the household. This is where there's no needs are like being met. That being said, again, nobody is perfect in this world. So it's not to say, oh, one time you went ahead and you weren't there for your child emotionally because you were really drained from like a long day at work and your kid came to you and you kind of shut them down. Your kid's not going to get a dismissive, avoidant, anxious attachment style from that one encounter. It's just the repetition. What was the overall environment?
Yeah. Which
inside the
neuronal
home?
network did you strengthen the most?
Yeah, which protective parts of yourself did you strengthen the most? This is where attachment theory leads into IFS.
Someone who has a secure environment that is able to develop that style is most likely not going to go and find an insecure attachment as
Yes.
a beneficial
So,
partner.
yes, I love that you brought that up because when we enter into our adult relationships, we typically seek out romantic partners that will mimic the relationship that we had with our most difficult parent, that will also mimic the style and dynamic of the relationship that we had. And this is in an unconscious attempt to repair the original wound through our now new primary attachment figure, our romantic partner.
Yeah.
So the thing is that, birds of a feather flock together, right? It goes the same thing with this, is that you're going to go ahead and seek out, number one, what's the most familiar, even if what's most familiar is unhealthy for you. That's just the way the brain works. The brain craves the familiar. The brain is like, I rather deal with what I know than what I don't know. So you're going to unconsciously seek out patterns in relationships, the same type of people. How many times will people say it's the same person, different body? It's this. That's just what happens. It's because if you're not healing your protective parts and you're not unburdening yourself from your wounds and your extreme beliefs that you have formed, you're just going to go ahead and keep attracting those same things into your life that mimic what you really believe about yourself and what you believe about the world. And so
I can't begin to tell you how true that is. From a personal experience, from everything that I've seen in my entire life, that is such a powerful and profound statement. And I think it warrants repeating, not repeating in the exact same way, but maybe repeating with an example. Because if you don't understand this, you're doomed to go ahead and continue going into cycles that are never ending.
yeah. I mean, how many times do you hear somebody say, I fell for it again, right? Like in relationships, it's happening to me again. Why does this always happen to me?
Yeah.
How many times do people say that when they end one relationship and they're like, I don't know how I always end up in the same situation?
Absolutely.
It's because you have these unconscious, subconscious beliefs that are affecting how you see the world and are going to go ahead and affect your behaviors and the people that you are attracted to.
Yeah. And a lot of people, when they hear this, they sometimes get defensive. They go ahead and think to themselves, it's never me. It's always an external source. It's always this other person. But I would advise to stop doing that for one very important reason. You can't control the external environment. You can only control what's internal. So what do you want? Do you want the ability to have the capability, which we're trying to go ahead and give you in this podcast, to change your internal environment so that you can stop getting in this cycle? Or do you want it to continuously be outside out of something you can actually change? So that's, try to understand that the change is possible and it comes from within you. That way you need to go ahead and, admit to yourself that if you start to see that these cycles are happening over and over again, the source of the problem is your inability to find these red flags.
Yeah. And so ignoring red flags in a relationship comes directly from what you learned in your childhood. If you had a house that didn't have a lot of boundaries and the family was very enmeshed with one another, and enmeshed means that I don't know where you begin and I begin. Your feelings are my feelings. It's just whoever feels this in the household, that's how all of us feel at once. What's interesting is when you start understanding IFS, you can see it in culture. So certain cultures have certain types of family patterns, certain types of communication patterns, right? And these are all just parts. This is the generational trauma that comes from parts that stems from attachment.
The reason why a lot of people have a good life and choose to stay in a good life is because there's nothing wrong with a good life, you know? And what we're trying to go ahead and do is show people how to have a great life. And that decision has to be conscious. You can't go ahead and say, I'm going to have a great life and it just comes to you. You have to go ahead and work on it. And the problem with, I guess, therapy or the not understanding how therapy actually works is you have to understand that therapy works like a gym membership. You know, like you have to go ahead and train your mind to be able to go ahead and understand how it functions in the first place, and then train your mind to be able to go ahead and change those neuronal networks to serve you instead of having those neural networks essentially inhibit you from reaching that success.
Yeah, and I want to like make it known to people that I love just using the example of having a therapist, and specifically when I say therapist, really trying to find one that has internal family systems somewhat incorporated into their model of practice. Now, they can have other ones like somatic experiencing is really great, other type of therapy. Like I mentioned before, there are other ones, EMDR, AEDP. There's a lot of other modalities that use some of these same underlying themes that really are useful. Just making sure that you're using an experiential type of therapy, using your body and your mind, not just thinking about it, talking about it, but really getting into your body. Where does this belief show up in my body? Do I feel heaviness on my chest? Do I feel like I can't breathe? Do I feel tension in my shoulders? Really using your body in conjunction with your mind, because that's how you're really going to get that freedom and that result that you're looking for. But equating therapy as hiring a personal trainer, right? The personal trainer, a good personal trainer is not doing the work for you. They're not the ones lifting the weight. You're the one lifting the weight. And that also shows you that how fast you're going to progress in therapy is based on your willingness. And that is a positive thing, because the fact is that you're only going to go as far as you really want to go. So you don't have to necessarily worry. A lot of people worry about this. Like, I'm going to go to therapy. I'm going to find out something that I don't want to know about myself. Or I'm going to go and my therapist is going to push me and I'm going to get overwhelmed by the experience. A good therapist, you're not going to be in that situation. They're really your guide. They're your personal trainer. And you're the one who's lifting that weight. You're the one who's going to those places within you that need that comfort and that connection that they never got. And so it's really going to go ahead and go at your pace. So I hope that that's encouraging for people to understand that you're not going to go and leave a completely disheveled mess. Can you have hard moments? Yes, but really like the process is in your hands.
Yeah, and I think, like you said, a good therapist, that we're trying to go ahead and even change the concept of even what a therapist is in the first place. In reality, the only real therapist is yourself. That's the only person that's going to be able to go ahead and make those changes. Like you said, if I go to the gym, I'm the only person lifting up those weights. So when I go to a therapist, I'm the only one that's actually able to understand what's going on in my mind, to understand that these techniques are actually functioning. The therapist is only there just to go ahead and make sure that you're doing the techniques correctly and to show you what the techniques are in
And
the
to
first
be
place.
that supportive
Absolutely.
person that they never got before, to
Absolutely.
be the
To
self,
show you that it's
to
capable too.
to model the
Absolutely.
self.
Because like you were saying, you didn't experience somebody that did understand those concepts, that was able to go ahead and show you how to become himself, or essentially be a figure.
Yeah, and I definitely want to mention, because we talked about this before and we never did it, which is when we say true self, what we're really trying to say is your authentic self.
Yes, absolutely. Your authentic self.
Because all these parts of you are true. All these parts of you are real. There are no bad parts. All these parts really do want the best for you. Even the ones that have behaviors that you really don't like, they all have positive intentions for your life. They're there for a reason. We need to befriend all these parts of ourselves. We're not asking any parts to leave. We're not trying to get rid of any. We're just trying to help ease their load, unburden them from these extreme beliefs that are rooted in the past, that don't have to be your reality any longer.
Absolutely. I like to go ahead and equate these malfunctioning parts as old programs that we learned. At one point, these programs served a function that obviously were made up on the spot. And the thing is that these programs are going to continue doing the same function over and over and over again. So what's going to happen throughout everyone's life is you're going to go ahead and see a situation. It's going to remind you of, oh, I need to go ahead and use such and such program to go ahead and handle the situation because it reminds me of the last time I used it. And then the real question is this program going to get you the result that you want? If you feel that that result isn't necessarily happening, as in you're not happy with the result that you're getting, then it's time to update this program. But for a lot of people, they don't understand that that's even a possibility. They think that that incorrect result that they continue to go ahead and get is an inherent nature of their being, and that's not necessarily the case. Let's talk about how we could go ahead and use these IFS therapeutic techniques, even if it's something very simple. Like, how can we go ahead and actually start using the knowledge of what we already know, that understanding the attachment styles sets us up for, these issues or these parts that are strategies. But how can we actually just use IFS therapy to help us out in a relationship this very second?
Yeah. So I think number one, bringing a lot of curiosity into your relationship. Start seeing the fact that your partner has parts. Your mom, your dad, your sibling, your friend, your coworker, your boss, all have parts of themselves that are coming from their past experiences. And so these parts, again, when you're in an argument with somebody or a disagreement or whatever the case may be, when you're in a part, you're only seeing that situation through that one part's lens. You're not seeing it from any other perspective. That's why they always say, like, if you're really struggling with something or you're fighting about something a lot, like, you need to take some time away from that to reevaluate it before you come back. That's the whole idea, is to try to get some disconnect from that one part that is so overwhelming you and so clouding your particular judgment in that situation. Take a little bit of a step back for your nervous system to calm down so that this part feels safe enough to go ahead and chill out a little bit, so that you can then hopefully gain some access from yourself where that clarity is, to be able to then appropriately handle that particular situation.
Yeah. And what you said, to piggyback on what you're talking about, you have to realize that everybody has an authentic self. Somewhere in people's psyche is the authentic version of who they truly are. And that is being compassionate, being calm, being creative, being curious, being connected, being, what are the ones?
Having clarity, having courage, confidence.
Exactly. So if you understand that, that means that when they're not behaving with those characteristics, they are in a part. That itself is enough to go ahead and be, or for me at least, that's enough to be able to create a separateness. I understand that they're in a part. And because I understand that they're in a part, that's not who they really are. And that separateness, or creating that little bit of separation between their authentic self and the part that's currently taking over, is enough to go ahead and be like, you know what, that's not who they really are. So if I'm arguing with somebody, that helps me a lot more be able to communicate. Another thing is also being able to even speak from a part. So if I'm in an argument with somebody who understands internal family systems, we could go ahead and even change the vernacular or the vocabulary of what we normally go ahead and use. Instead of saying, listen, I'm upset about this, or I'm upset about that, it's more like, I have a part that's upset about. You're trying to go ahead and tell the other person, there's a part of me that isn't who I really am that feels this way.
Yeah, I just want the listener, the viewer, to understand these parts are a part of you, right? But they're not coming from that present centered space occurring in this present moment.
Exactly.
They're somewhere in the past. So
Absolutely.
That's what he means by, oh, that's not a true part of you. No, it's still a part of you, but it's just not in the present moment. So you're not going to see the situation as clearly, because again, these parts are filtering it through their lens of past experience.
I've seen some fights, for example, from friends to a friend and their significant other, or two buddies of mine, or whatever, just any forms of relationships. I've seen fights where one person is essentially living in this false reality. They're exaggerating the situation. And I'm sure everyone has seen that before. And that's exactly what we're talking about. We're talking about that through their lens, through that person's part. They distorted their reality so much because of their previous experience that it really is the way they're viewing it. So it's no longer a question of, are they actually being truthful? I really do believe they really do believe reality is the way they perceive it. But the problem is that's not what's really happening. So now you don't have to go ahead and even discuss, that's not what really happened. Now it's, Why do you think that happened? Because that's definitely not what happened.
Bringing that curiosity
Exactly.
in.
Absolutely.
Using very like, can you tell me more about what it is that you're thinking, more that it is that you're feeling? Really
Exactly.
just in your relationship, in your disagreements with somebody, really just the ultimate goal is obviously some type of resolution, right? It's some type of compromise, it's some type of connection.
Yes.
So really viewing it from that goal, that's like, I want to stay connected with this person. I want to build this connection with this person in whatever relationship it is. How can I go ahead and get there? Well, you're not going to get there from being judgmental. You're not going to get there from blaming, you know?
Yeah. Essentially, you're not going to get there if you're in your own part.
Yeah, because again, the part's only going to have its limited capacity through its past experience.
Yeah. You have to find out why this person is so obviously incorrect, but in a nice way, essentially.
Yeah,
Like using your
compassionate,
truth.
curious
Exactly.
way, knowing that a part of them is really triggered in this moment. That's why they're showing up in this way.
And they really do believe that too. You know, so again, it's not worth the argument and trying to go ahead and show them logically.
We all have these younger parts of ourselves inside of us, and they've been neglected, they've been wounded, they've been hurt. And so when you're having difficulty in any relationship, realize that like a younger part of this person is still trying to have some type of need met in whatever way it's coming out on the surface. Just realize that underneath they're trying to have some type of need met. And so can you become curious as to what need are they actually trying to have met through whatever this situation is?
Yeah.
And starting there in terms of any relationship, like somebody cuts you off on the street and gives you the finger, even though it was clearly their fault, right? Just be like, oh, that person has a part of them that really can't feel shame, can't accept that they made a mistake. That's why they're getting angry. They have an angry protective part that's trying to cover up the shame for their mistake of cutting you off.
Yeah.